Okay, morning guys, and welcome to episode number 4 of the RPE podcast. So today we're going to be covering some more fun topics in coaching, I guess. So we're going to be covering some coaching theory stuff, some movement learning theory stuff, and technique coaching, cueing, that type of gear. So if everyone wants to quickly introduce themselves again. So my name's Steve Collins from the Joint Physiotherapy in Nunda. We have there Connor.
My name is Parke. I work at Exintaris in Devonport.
Cool.
And I'm Dan Exintaris, work at PLAE Australia.
Awesome. Okay, so the very first type of thing that we want to cover is our motor learning theories today. So motor learning theories, I guess, are really important, I guess, regarding your how you're coaching or going into that specificity principle of earlier, like why you're going to be choosing certain movements that you're going to be coaching. So there's a couple of different theories here that are really important. You've got your dynamical systems theory, and then you have the old, I think it's Newell's theory, which is the whole task, environment, and individual constraint stuff. So you remember covering that in uni there, Connor?
Yep, sure do. We went down on it.
Individual task and environment, isn't it?
Yeah, and the individual included things like cognition, actual physical ability, and then the environment were things that were able to be changed and not changed, and then the task was essentially just what kind of task it was.
Yes, yeah, that's right, exactly. So I guess when we're looking to apply this into coaching practice, realistically, I guess you're just looking at using, I guess, your knowledge of the individual, your knowledge of what, I guess, they can and can't do. So if they're an injury kind of thing, you're looking at, the tissues that are good, the tissues that are bad, how that's going to interact with the task and the environment to make sure you're getting, applying that specificity principle to achieve the goal that you're after. So do you have any other big kind of takeaway on that, Connor?
No, not really. That's, just got to make sure that you've analysed every different part, whether it's the person you're training, the skill you're training, and then the environment that you're training them in. Cool.
Nice. And then that leads pretty well into the dynamical systems theory, which I think is the big one there, which is basically that, I guess, that the task, has many different ways or a spectrum of ways of which you can achieve it, and the individual will, depending on, I guess, their strengths and weaknesses and the environmental constraints, will choose through like this automatic feedback process through their cerebellum, will figure out the best way to perform that task. So is that, I guess, your take on dynamical systems theory there?
So movement is it's a solution to a task. So given the constraints of the environment, given the constraints of the person's ability, they'll come up with a certain way to complete the task, and given the constraints of the task as well. So for instance, if it's soccer, and the task is to kick a ball, then you're not allowed to use your hands, obviously. So that's the constraints of the task. You've got to stay within inside a field of play, and there's other people on the field. So there are environmental factors that you can't control. So then the individual has to come up with a solution to that movement task, which is to get the ball from A to B, and they will do that in any kind of technique that they see fit. But that's essentially how I kind of view it.
So then putting it into more like, I guess, the rehab context, a really good way to explain this one is like with your ACLs, and how squat strength doesn't always correlate with them actually being ready to return to play, because they can use other compensatory strategies to. So squat strength for a very healthy individual is a good kind of knowledge of how their quads and glutes are kind of going together, or their full extensor, kind of lower limb extensor mechanism. But post ACLs, there's this really good research that even though to the eye it might look good, when you put them on a force deck, they're actually transferring either weight away from that side, or they're using more of a hip dominant strategy. So because they, as an individual, have a deficit, but we're still making them do a task, they will just organize their body or their system in a certain way in which they can achieve that task, but it might not be the way that we actually intended or wanted it to be.
Yeah, and Steve, that's probably it could also be a subconscious thing too. So they might be moving away from that injured limb because they still feel that there's a threat.
Yes.
So over time, you've got to learn psychologically that you can trust that that surgical repair or that injured limb to use it again. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've seen that a lot. You just do an automatic shift away from it.
And it's a really good thing in that it's like, I guess it's the perceptions of the person as well. So like the individual plays into not only like their anatomical things, but it's also, you know, their perceptions of what's happening in the environment, their psychological perceptions of the task as well. So like all of these things, it's not only the person's, I guess, body, it's also the person's perceptions of their body and also the person's perceptions of the environment, which will change the way in which they have to actually perform the task. So there's one really good example here. I used to, before I knew a lot about dynamical systems theory, with my return to PLAE lower limb guys, I used to be really big on going, hey, let's let them in to get them confidence in the sport. So say rugby league, get them confidence in the sport really early on. I'd try to introduce them into whatever training I could early on, actual like whatever on field training with the rest of the guys I could at the highest possible intensity that it looked that they were comfortable with participating in as early as I could. That works through a certain extent, but then you realize when you get to the very top end of them returning to play and they're doing things really quickly and they're doing things without having time to think, a lot of times the person just doesn't quite look right or just doesn't quite look there, or their technique looks a bit different to what it did pre-injury. And it's because you've sent them out into the task that of the game of rugby league, but without all of the individual strengths that they need to play that. So their body has learned a way to compensate, because they're athletes. They're going to learn how to be able to use their body in a different way, but you've kind of accidentally taught them to become or do a less efficient way. So they'll be very good, say it was a knee or an ankle thing, they'll be very good at using hip strategies to decelerate, which when you get onto the field and someone's running at you, you don't have time to stop and think or use a hip strategy because you're going to put yourself in a dangerous position, or you're just going to be slower than what you were. So now I'm more on the, having learned more about dynamical systems theory and knowing that the person's going to be able to kind of try to achieve the task however it is that they can. I'm now kind of really making sure that all the component parts of that individual are up to actually the task that I'm wanting them to do. So that way I'm not, you know, putting them out there and making them adapt to, I guess, a new way of doing the task. I want them to be able to be as strong as they need to be as quick as they need to be as fit as they need to be before I'm putting them into those higher level tasks. So that way they're not learning to do things incorrectly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, putting them into an environment of chaos too early.
Yes.
Before they're ready, can actually maybe set them back. Maybe not in terms of performance, but maybe in terms of their longevity, their ability to then some sort of other overuse or also some sort of other injury that may come about.
And it's also just not like conducive to performance, I guess, because you've taught someone to do something in a manner in which they previously wouldn't have had to use, or previously it wasn't like their best strategy, and now you're sending them back out there to learn, I guess, an incorrect strategy. So yes, I've definitely changed the way, and probably only the last year and a half that I rehab now. So now it's like I let them do little bits and pieces that I know aren't going to be stressing their system to max, where they're going to have to be finding new movement strategies. So I'll let them have the little wins of getting out there on the field and doing things that are very low intensity, so they're not having to learn anything. But I'm now saying to the coach, to the head of high performance, no, this person can't go and do, some small-sided games, or no, they can't do this until they've reached, like, say, 95% or 90% of their leg symmetry index or limb symmetry index, because I know that if they don't actually have the required strength in that tissue, or they don't have the required endurance in that tissue, well then when it comes to time that their body is having to make a decision, they're going to be making and learning the wrong decision. And as we know with motor learning, as we said in the last episode, it's frequency of repetition. So if I send them out once every blue moon and they do it, that's okay. But if every session they're getting in there and they're doing something relatively high intensity without the capacity to do it, then they're going to just be learning the wrong thing over and over and over. And then once you've learned the wrong thing, it's really, really hard to unlearn, because it takes that exact same process of heaps and heaps and heaps of repetitions.
Yeah, so it's more about once you put them out there too soon and they develop that deficiency, you've then got to teach them. Yeah, you got to unlearn that deficiency and then reteach them again. So
yeah. So that's where the really good rehab is now coming into it. I think with the knowledge of dynamical systems theory, you will really make sure that you have the individual, because you've had to analyze the task and the environment in which the individual will be acting. And now you're having to make sure the individual actually is going to meet the demands of the environment and the task before you're putting them in there. Otherwise, you are kind of setting them up to fail. And that's kind of backed pretty well by the research now, I believe, in both open and kind of closed tasks. So as we said before, in squatting, if you don't have the capacity for it, in your quads, you'll jump back into the hips. In decelerating, in a task with rugby league or whatever sport, soccer, you're running, if someone's moving in front of you, you're adjusting or having to adapt to what they're doing. If you don't have the ability to quickly kind of absorb that force, you're going to go and either slowly absorb that force or really having to sit into heaps of flexion to absorb that force. And that's where other things, compensations, will come into play, like knee valgus, etc.
Something that I've done personally, and something that I know a lot of sports teams do, is that they send the athlete back, not necessarily straight to the senior group. Like they might send them to the under 18s first and get them to train there, and then send them to the reserves, which is obviously the same sport, but at a much lower intensity. Is that something that you guys often would do?
No, I haven't seen that. They may, someone's returning from injury, they'll be in the rehab group until a point where they can join the main group for a little bit, and then they'll just be in that main group. Yeah, they may play some game time in reserve grade, but depends on. Actually, Steve will probably back it up. Depends on how the team's going, and the pressure from the coach, and then what type, who the player is. So if the player is someone who's played 100 and odd games or of the top grade, then they're going to be put straight back into first grade straight away. If it's, say, a developmental player, you might bring them back through the grades, but that's usually a sporting coach's decision. You can give them your advice, but at the end of the day, that's up to the sport coaches.
I reckon theoretically, kind of though, going on this dynamical systems theory, it's not probably the worst idea to be looking at introducing this. So you're not either that, or you just got to hold them back into rehab more and just give them little little wins on the field, but ones that aren't involved in that really high level thing where they could be learning compensations. Because I think there's a little bit of a body of research starting now to show that these compensations could be things that lead to, you know, your re-ruptured ACLs, your chronic ankle sprains, etc., because we're just sending people back into training without the capacities to actually do it. So I reckon the dynamical systems theory really works well in with then technique, because I guess the things that you're wanting to target in the gym are those techniques to make sure you're getting the individual kind of capacities built up. So do we want to talk about technique, I guess ranges of technique, that type of stuff, what's good, what's bad? Dan, I know that you have a bit of a take on this, so do you want to have a little bit of a lead here?
Yeah, so I guess technique, when we're talking about exercise and exercise prescription, I think I said in the other podcast, I have a specific range in which I'm comfortable with, because I don't believe that technique is black and white. It's actually an area of grey, and then there's person to person is so different because their limb lengths are so different. So what one person looks good in, say, we're talking, for example, a barbell squat, and another person may look totally different because they've got longer femurs, or they've got some other anthropometric sort of difference, which everybody does.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a range in which I think I'm comfortable with, and then outside of that range, I'll start to correct, and then so
I think your ranges as well. It's interesting. So I'm exactly the same, Conor. I would assume you're the same, and I think your range will depend on your context as well. So high performance, your range is probably a little bit narrower. Kind of rehab, like early rehab, to making sure that, again, that you're getting it onto a certain tissue. If you're having to load a certain tissue, you may put in constraints in the environment to make sure that your range is quite narrow, so that it's a lot more likely that that tissue is getting the load. But then if it's kind of, you're just generally working with a rehab person, building up their capacity in a couple of different movements, you might actually allow quite a large range. So like, I know certain things that in general population that I let, who are doing rehab with me, that I let pass as a deadlift these days. If I look back at my old, I guess, movement Nazi self as a personal trainer, I would have been looking at me as a physio going, that guy is an idiot. Why is he letting that person kind of do that, you know? But I know that, you know, the risk reward, because the weight's so low, this person is coming to me in the context of they were super fearful of movement before. I don't want to be there going, no, you have to, you know, keep your back perfectly straight. You know, this hips must be pushing back. If they've kind of got in, I've taught them the technique, their bodies organize themselves in a way that they thought was correct. They've moved the load. It looked okay. It didn't make me kind of want to vomit watching it, but it wasn't the exact movement that I was after. But they felt completely fine during it, and the light was that low, the load was that light, that the risk was that low. I'm not going to, because I know that the individual in this kind of task and environment, I know the individual has these cognitive parts of them that is really, say, hyper vigilant on movement and awareness. I'm not wanting to feed that and feed that fear by going, hey, you picked that up wrong, you could be at risk of injury. As long as it was within my bigger range that I was happy with, that we are going to be able to progressively load, and I might be able to just kind of use shaping, so where I'm kind of just changing the technique over a longer period of time, you know. So day one, the technique might be a deadlift that looks a bit like that, and eventually after day 30, we might be having a back that's straight. Well, then I'm okay with that in that context. But then in a context where I'm wanting high performance, obviously the range is a lot lower because you're just wanting to be biomechanically efficient. So I think efficiency comes into how efficient you need the movement to be, comes into your acceptable range of technique.
Yeah, I agree, because you want, so when you're trying to move heavy loads, the more efficient you are in stacking your joints and the more efficient you are in your movement pattern, the easier it will be to move the greater load. So once you get out of that realm and you start to get out of the groove, I think that's when you sort of become a little bit dangerous, because then you start using things that you're not intending to use, so certain muscle groups that you weren't really wanting to use in that exercise, and then they start to get loaded more than what they're actually, capable of doing, and then that's when you sort of run into problems. So,
and
I agree with you. I think that you've got to be careful with what language you use too around technique. You can't go, "Oh, that's bad technique," because then they'll always be fearful of some exercise. We've always seen people fearful of a deadlift. I always hurt my lower back deadlifting.
Yep.
Well, that's not the deadlift. It's the way you're doing it. Or there's some sort of psychological connotation with, when I deadlift, I injure my back.
Yeah.
Therefore, I can. So
that's going into the whole realm of, there's all these things in like pain science research, like neuro tags and all this type of stuff, which we won't go into here, but there are all those associative things that can, like neural connections that can happen up here, that again, it's just a learning process of they've been built over time, and those things are so hard to break. So you don't want to be, I guess, building, you don't want to be further strengthening those tags as a coach or as a therapist. Your use of language is really important, which I really think is a good place at like cueing and setting up your environment comes into play there. So I guess cueing an environment, so you got your internal cues and you have your external cues, and I think each actually does have validity in different contexts. So for me and my understanding of the research, and my eyes were completely open when I went and saw Nick Winkelman speak at the ASCA conference last year. It was amazing, but from there I've dug deeper into the research, and my understanding of it is, so you got like internal cues, which is getting the person to be introspective or thinking about their body's movement, really thinking about, say, in bodybuilding, it was that old mind-muscle connection, and Brad Schoenfeld has actually shown that if you're wanting to increase kind of EMG readings in a muscle, having an internal cue is really good for that. So there's thoughts that maybe internal cueing might be best for, say, hypertrophic gains, or very, very early stage rehab when you're wanting someone to activate a specific muscle, getting them to actually have an internal cue on that type of thing. So for the example, it would be like squeeze your quadriceps in the early inner range quad, and maybe even having them put their hand on their quadricep and really feeling it squeeze under them. But then when you're getting someone later stage, or even anything other than early mid stage, you're really not wanting that person to be thinking about their body in the task. You're wanting someone to be using the external cues of the environment to be able to organize their movement system. And going forward with learning, external cues have been found for learning in everything from stroke through to high performance, like hitting a baseball, learning a soccer chip kick. External cues have been shown to be the way to go. So does anyone have a major kind of takeaway on what external cues are and how to use them?
Yeah, external cues will be doing something or telling someone something relative to the environment they're in. So, for instance, if you're doing a squat, an external cue would be push the floor away. So it's something that's happening outside of your body. You're doing something to the environment. Yep. Whereas, like you said, an internal cue would be straighten the knees or squeeze the quads or something like that. Or something else, explode off the floor. That's something that's going to be an external cue, as opposed to get up quickly.
One of the best ways I think to teach, like say a low bar squat, or if you're wanting someone to be more hip dominant in a squat, just putting like a chair behind them and saying, I want you to sit back, and having it maybe a little bit further behind in each couple of reps or something until you've got approximately the movement that you're after, you know what I mean? So getting them to sit back into a chair is a really big one. One of my favorite that I use for hip stability is I get someone to carry a tray on their ASIS, so on their front pointer bones of their hips, and I get them to stand on one leg and just do a little step down, and I say, it's your shout at the pub, I don't want you to spill the beers. And so I guess the thing with external cues, you have to know what the internal cue would have been. You have to know the biomechanics of what you were trying to achieve, and then you have to manipulate the environment so you can have some sort of either environmental constraint that they are having to adhere to in the task, or you have some sort of cue which is I guess an internalized environmental constraint. So that if there's not an actual thing there that they've got to focus on, something that they can be pretending to focus on, etc., that then achieves those biomechanical outcomes that you're after. So I guess you have to know your biomechanics really well, but then you're not wanting the person to focus on the biomechanics because they're not a physiotherapist, they're not a strength and conditioning coach. It doesn't matter to them what's happening. It matters to you what's happening, but you want them to actually learn. And to learn, the research shows, is external cueing. So yeah, it's setting up your environment in a way in which to achieve all those internal biomechanical kind of positions. So yeah, 100%. So any take on that kind of, Dan, on your biggest kind of uses of that external cueing?
Yeah, I guess in terms of where I sort of coach, a lot also comes down to the experience level of the lifter or the athlete. So if I'm coaching a lifter and they're highly experienced, they can actually use those internal cues mid-set, every rep. Whereas if I'm coaching someone who has not a lot of experience in the weight room, I'll let them do their reps and then I'll give them a cue at the end, or give them feedback at the end, and then they'll cover it next set. So I wouldn't want them to be thinking about too much mid-set. So, and those cues I will use majority external, meaning from novice to elite. Not that I coach too many elite athletes, but I'm talking about in terms of when someone's technique is sound, I classify them as, you can start looking at internal versus external. And sometimes I might even use, say, some sort of prop. And what I mean by that is I guess a big one is when I see someone try and deadlift with a straight bar, and I see that bar drifting away from their center of mass. And you want to tell them to pull the bar in, squeeze the lats, or whatever someone will say. That's internally, right? But they don't know what that feels like. So a good cue, what I'll do is I'll wrap a band around the bar, and I'll stand in front of the bar, and I'll pull that band, and that band will want to pull that bar away. And I'll get them to try and pull that bar back in close to their body. So then they get the feel of what it means to lats tight, or what have you, or whatever you want to get the bar tight. So that'll give them the feel for that, and then I'll let them go. And then that way they've got that background now as to what they should feel. And then,
well, that's a big thing they've actually found with a way that you can, I guess, take an internal cue, or take a cue that brings someone's awareness into their body, and then get them to be able to apply it without thinking about it in a task is like supersetting, say. So in rugby league, what I used to do with, so teaching people like deceleration kind of techniques, was I would superset, like teaching them, say, a deceleration kind of drill with them, putting them into a small-sided game that had deceleration as like a main kind of component of it. There was lots and lots of kind of deceleration. So we'd spend like a couple of minutes just really doing something that was getting them to focus on a position that they wanted to be able to kind of perfect or feel. And then we would superset that with something that more had external environmental kind of constraints or tasks, but they had already learned that interoception, that kind of feeling of what their body wanted to, I guess, organize themselves into. But a big thing there is if you're doing that style task or that style way of doing it, you don't want to be doing it under heaps of fatigue. So that game-based thing was only ever, it was high frequency, but it was short duration. You know what I mean? So I didn't want it to, if you're trying to teach someone a new task that way, you don't, and same Dan, you wouldn't have then gone and given, you know, sets of 30 deadlifts, because the first 5 they probably would have done exactly as you said. And then as fatigue kicks in, dynamical systems theories states that they're just going to move into the way that their body knows to produce the best amount of force, and it probably isn't the way that you were trying to teach them yet.
Oh yeah, that you actually bring up a good point, because this is something that I typically see a lot. So say, I'll just be real quick here. The old, let's just go with 2 sets of 12, say on a big compound movement. You want to teach someone, so 2 sets of 12 or whatever, so 24 reps.
Yep.
The first 6, perfect, and then they start sort of going into this sort of range. So yep. I was a big fan of like, why not just give them 4 sets of 6?
I did the exact same thing with learners.
6 reps. They're always the same. You load them a little bit heavier. They're not going outside of that range of bar path or that technical sort of prowess range, and you sort of get them to learn the skill, I believe, much more efficiently than just loading them up with a higher number of reps. So
I worked a lot with youth.
Sorry, and I'll caveat that until they are a skilled lifter and they can do 12 reps with the same. Each rep looks the same.
So I learned that a lot with youth. Oh, I taught youth athletes, and they were like high-level athletes, but I was under the same, knowing my motor learning theories, knowing that they need lots and lots of repetitions, but also knowing that fatigue is going to decay technique. You have a bit of a dichotomy here, well, a bit of a problem that you as a coach have to solve. I have to get lots of reps into this person to learn, but I have to make sure that each rep is, I guess, using the environment, using their abilities, using the task in a way that they're going to organize themselves into the movement pattern that I'm wanting. So for me, the way I solved that task was to do a high frequency, or like a lot of sets, but at very low kind of reps when we were learning a movement. So, you know, they were doing things that probably would have looked more like a strength prescription, but the loads were a lot lower than what was on the bar for strength. And this is just because we were doing motor learning. So I was more talking about, like I did in my prescription for me learning handstands, etc. You know what I mean? I was doing things like 10 sets of 3, or, you know, so they were doing 30 total reps. But really the external load wasn't too high. And it was just so that I was in knowing that child's strengths as an individual, knowing the kind of the constraints of the environment, and knowing the tasks that I was needing at hand to be able to go, okay, well, this is the approximate range that I'm happy with of technique. And so I know that any more than, say, a few reps, their individual is going to decay their technique. They won't be able to achieve it anymore. So yeah, that was the, I guess, way that I solved that movement problem. Anyone else have any other big major takeaways before we kind of wrap any of this up?
I think we've covered some good application there, as well as the theory behind it.
Cool.
Yep. I'd be the same. I think we covered most of it, from everything from how you word your cues and like how you reinforce them to how you set them up physically to how you actually want them to perform the task, and like ranges of what's safe and what's efficient. I think that's pretty much dynamic systems theory.
Cool.
I will just say, I just, for anyone that's wanting to learn about it, I just can't recommend enough Nick Winkelmann's work. And then I think that's just so important, the language of coaching. I think that's because that's basically what you're trying to do. You're trying to express what you want the client or patient or athlete to do. And I think that the language you use is very important.
Yes. Language is like the thing that carries the message for no matter what the coach or therapist is putting across, I guess. So language is a massive thing going forward for how we get out of our brain what we're wanting into the athlete's brain. And basically it's being able to shape through our words how we want them to perceive how we want to move. And then we see that application in the way that they've actually moved. So it's a really cool thing because you have kind of put some words out there and you see how they've responded to it. And then you've got to kind of adjust together to either make your words a little bit different or the athlete's perception of your words a little bit different. So it's something where you're always working together to refine it. You'll never get it first go, but that's okay. It's always just a refining process as we go. All right, guys. So that's been a great chat today about all things motor learning, dynamical systems theories, coaching, cueing. So this is where we're going to wrap up. Connor is going to summarize everything that we've been covering. We're going to be sharing a link to all references that we've talked about during today. Yes, if you have any other questions, remember to hit us up in the comments below.